Welcome back, everyone, to the first episode of another series of the first 20. This time, we're going to be going down the road of DSLR/mirrorless photography. This is going to be a very interesting journey because not only is this something I've never done before, but this is something I never thought I'd have any interest in. And as I've been doing the research, I'm finding just how interesting it actually can be and how deep of rabbit holes you can go down. Alongside this first 20 hours, I also started an Instagram where I am doing a 365-day photography challenge. Self-explanatory, to make sure I take one photo every single day for 365 days. I am not going to stop until I get 365 photos. The link to that will be below in the description of this and every video for this series. Hopefully you'll follow along. And when I get to color grading one day, which I do want to get to, it'll be interesting to see how that morphs. For this series, the main source I'm going to be using is Skillshare, specifically Phil Ebner's course on photography. Now, this masterclass in and of itself is almost 17 hours. This series I want specifically to be just the actual mechanical act of photography and techniques and whatnot, getting familiar with my Canon M50. So for right now, given that this is the beginning, I have a rough idea of the direction I want to go based on the syllabus I've seen, and I may deviate with some articles and some YouTube videos here and there. But the topics that I want to cover are the basic principles on the exposure triangle, understanding focal length and aperture, lighting, and then within the course, they have some introductory techniques on landscape photography, portrait photography, and product photography. At least the ones that I've mentioned here, those are the ones that I would like to tackle in this 20 hours. Couple caveats though before we begin. Number one, you may see me in a change of clothes maybe more than once in one particular episode. And I'm gonna let you in on a little bit of an editing secret. Not everything is filmed in one day. Fortunately, as I've mentioned in the past, my entire wardrobe is just one large spectrum of gray, so you might not even notice. Second caveat, as I'm going along, I'm realizing that my lighting sucks. Bear with me on that. The third caveat is this is one of those learning exercises. This is one of those crafts that requires a lot of time out and about, on location. First 20 on location. So I'm going to try to figure out a way to incorporate that into this. But nonetheless, I'm excited. I hope you're excited. I hope this benefits you as much as it's about to benefit me. So let's get started. All right, so already off the bat, there's a ton of information coming at me. What seems like some of the most important information, and that's with exposure. Now, exposure is basically, I don't know if I want to say the brightness of the image, but I think exposure is the general reception of the spectrum of light. You can under or overexpose an image, and you can have an image where there's sections that are over and underexposed. So for example, I guess if you were to take a picture of something indoors next to a window on a bright sunny day, you can control the exposure to determine how much light is coming in from the image and how much detail you're getting in the darker areas. But as you brighten things up, the outside light is going to get too much, and that becomes overexposed in the windows, whereas you're properly exposed for the thing you want to look at. On the contrary, if you bring it down so that the outside doesn't look so blown out, you're going to lose details in the darker areas because they're just going to become darker. And I guess that makes sense now that I'm just thinking about it because of the things that affect exposure. And you have three basic things. You have ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. And it's funny because I've heard these terms in passing so many times, and now it makes sense. And it's basically like an eye. And you have the pupil in the iris, which is the part that dilates and constricts, and then you have blinking, and then you have ISO, which really doesn't apply to a normal human eye. But so these three things control the exposure of the picture, which is the amount of light coming in from the entire image. So let me go through them to make sure that I understand completely. So aperture is the opening that allows light to come in to the sensor, and that's measured by an f number, f-stop, as they call it. But the key to remember is that the f-stop goes down as the aperture opens up. So as you close the aperture, you're going to have a higher f-stop number. The next thing would be shutter speed, and shutter speed would be like the blinking of the eye. That's more the amount of light over time. So if it's closing quickly, or if you imagine it starting out closed and then it opens and closes, you can imagine only a certain amount of light can get in. That's going to expose the image a little bit less. Now, if you take longer and it goes like this, that's a lot more time for light to get in. So all of the light that got in that period of time will make up the exposure of the image. And then the last one is ISO, which I feel like right off the bat, this is like a last resort type thing. That's just digitally enhancing. I used the word in my notes, exaggerating the sensitivity of the sensor. So if you increase your ISO or ISO, you are artificially increasing the exposure of the image. So now that we've understood a bit about how to control the luminance of a photo, the next thing is to understand the context of a picture or its composition. So let's go through that. Composition, as we've just learned, is comprised of certain rules. There are certain things about the composition of a photo, and there are certain things about the rules or guides that you can use to bring more interest to the picture itself. The first rule is the rule of thirds. This one is the most interesting to me. With the rule of thirds, you basically just divide the view into 3 vertically and horizontally. And so you create 9 boxes. What typically ends up happening is when you're starting to take pictures, you put the subject in the middle of your shot, whereas with the rule of thirds, what you can do is you can use the intersections as guides on where to place your subject in the context of the photo. And so a lot of this has to do with context, just like a written composition has to do with not only the language being used, but also what's being talked about. Oftentimes when I remember speaking to somebody in a conversation, I remember things around me just as much as the person themselves. And I feel like the rule of thirds sort of takes advantage of that. Instead of having a person or an object right in the middle of the shot, you put them over to the right or to the left where those intersecting lines are, or you can even move them over and down or up into one particular intersection that can actually take the general background and almost bring a certain part of the background into the photo. So you still have the subject, but it seems a bit more relaxed because it's almost like you're bringing focus to a non-subject portion of the background. So you're leaving it as a background, but you're also bringing that part of it into context and changing the story depending on what's in the background. You could move over to another part and it could change the context entirely or give you a different story. The other really interesting one to me is negative space. That's rule number 2. Negative space, well, not rule, tool. Not rule, but tool number 2 would be negative space. This one was a little bit of an eye-opener for me because the first thing I think of when I think of negative space is an example of like you take a picture of something and you have your subject and then you remove the subject, almost like you cut the subject out, and that's a negative space. That's not what we're talking about here. With negative space, if you imagine a cloudy sky and you take a picture of a person and the background is that cloudy sky, it's not that it's a completely bland background, but it's a background that is generally stated, but not specific. So it's not pulling your attention. Your subject is still the subject, but almost like the grandiosity of the background and sort of the relative monotony of the background. You're bringing focus to the subject, right? It's making it more dramatic, but at the same time showing how small that subject is relative to the huge sky. And then you have a couple of other rules like symmetry, which is self-explanatory, right? Having a large object on one side and a small object on the other, or something like that. And leading lines. Leading lines is another idea where you use lines in the environment to kind of focus in on a subject. It could be lines on the road, it could be a path down a forest or a park or whatever. And then there's perspective. And perspective is literally just the perspective. You can be taking a shot from directly on or down below or top. But let's see what else we can find out there to give us a little bit more of an idea of what these rules bring to a picture. Okay, that was a lot, but I think these other videos sort of brought some of the rules into a bit of perspective. What I'm getting the feeling of is that the rules are not meant to be sort of in a list, but I think they sort of complement each other. More specifically, in my mind, the sub-rules that I mentioned, and I call them sub-rules in my own head, of perspective, symmetry, and leading lines, feed into the bigger, more popular rules of rule of thirds. What's really interesting is leading lines in particular. That stood out to me because it's very easy to take the term leading lines literally. I guess because when you read the term leading lines, you automatically get an idea and you're like, oh, I understand what that is. And then you see what the rule actually entails. I'm trying now not to think of leading to mean things that actually lead to the subject, but more leading as in the lines or the directionality of the background or of the periphery leads your eye to a particular frame. And, this is supported in ideas like using the rungs of a banister to frame your subject. Those beams that frame the subject are leading lines that lead your eye to a particular focus. And the other thing is, now I understand more why symmetry or asymmetry is important to pay attention to as well, because of the fact that when using the rule of thirds, it's very possible for you to become so focused on that rule that you lose sight of the fact that the picture may start to tip in a particular direction. For example, if you use negative space and the rule of thirds, you could potentially put too much of a subject or too much context into one part of the photo and the other part of the photo is too bland. That causes the picture to sort of tip. I imagine putting the picture on my finger and the weight of the image falls in one direction. That's not necessarily a good thing. You have these rules, and if you understand what the rules bring to the table, if you want the picture to say something specifically, you can deviate from the rules in order to give that feeling. For example, there are some photographers who will take photos that are meant to make you feel uneasy. Probably an example of certain rules being used in ways that they're not supposed to be used, or not supposed to be used according to the rule. This is very interesting. And this is exactly why sitting here and going through it in a classroom fashion just is not enough. And there's gonna be hours and hours of me being out there. Hey, future me here. Thanks for watching to the end of this video. In case you're wondering why I'm jumping in here, the reason is because as I was filming this whole thing, it was all on the fly. So I didn't exactly know when one episode would start and end. So here I am giving you an outro. I know that was a lot of jumbled information put together, but I hope the process of my thought through it kind of helped you see it a little bit more clearly. What I'm going to try to do throughout the episodes is come back and sort of summarize the main points that sort of build onto each other. But in the meantime, if you like that, stick around, because in the next episode, we're going to get a little bit deeper into focal length and understanding some more of depth of field. Or will I understand it? I don't know. Well, I do know because I already filmed it, but stick around.